Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, May 29th, 2018. I'm just back from a week off. We took a road trip to Southern California, caught up with a lot of friends and family. Had some fascinating conversations that I might share with you over the next few weeks. And gosh, Trump canceled the summit with Kim Jong-un. Now it's back on. The trade war was off. Now it appears to be back on. It's easy to get whiplash in the zigzag days of the Trump administration. But I start with a very important story, at least from my perspective, because recently, just in the last week or so, the nation of Ireland held a referendum, and they overturned the ban on abortion. This is a highly Catholic country that for years has banned abortion and required its female residents seeking to end a pregnancy to travel to England, Scotland, Wales, or the European continent. So now abortion rights are legal in uber-Catholic Ireland. But here in the United States, they're being chipped away at, and the Supreme Court, by declining to take up a critical case from Arkansas, is allowing that chipping to occur in very serious and disturbing ways. Because today the SCOTUS, Supreme Court, turned down a challenge to a restrictive Arkansas law that will end the use of medication abortions in the state and could close 2 of the 3 remaining abortion clinics. And these are pretextual laws that the promoters of say they're just to defend the health and the life of women. And of course, they're passed typically by male-dominant legislatures who thump on the Bible and pander to evangelicals as they take these steps, which I view as clearly unconstitutional. And the Arkansas law, it mirrors many of the other laws promoted by groups like ALEC and by anti-abortion activists. They're looking for every little way that they can restrict access, restrict the right of a woman to choose which way to end a pregnancy. And certainly, the medical abortion, the morning after pill, RU 486, is that what it was? There are various names. But it is certainly less risky and less intrusive than a traditional abortion. But that doesn't bother the Supreme Court. We don't know if there was a single justice who wanted to take up this case, because the court doesn't disclose until a majority views it one way or the other. But the history of this is a little complicated. U.S. District Judge Christine Baker had blocked the law, concluding that any medical benefit would be incrementally small, while the burden on a women's access to abortion would be substantial. The law, she said, was a solution in search of a problem. And the Supreme Court's recent history indicated that they would either take up this case or overturn But the recent history of the Supreme Court encouraged abortion advocates, because it was just 2 years ago they voted 5-3 to overturn a similar Texas law, pretextual, that required doctors who provided abortions to have admitting privileges in a local hospital. That Texas law, according to Justice Breyer, provided few, if any, health benefits for women, poses a substantial obstacle to women seeking abortions, and constitutes an undue burden on their constitutional right. But a panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit upheld the Arkansas law. They said that Judge Baker had failed to make factual findings estimating the number of women burdened by the statute. And that seems like a really trivial and arbitrary standard to use. So today the Supreme Court declined to accept the challenge without noted dissent, even from liberal justices who are supportive of abortion rights. And in the bigger picture, I encourage you to watch the coverage if there is much, of this Supreme Court. It's not a decision, capital D, but they made a decision not to take the case, which changes the law in Arkansas. And watch for Democratic elected officials. See if any of them speak up for a woman's right to choose and challenge the Supreme Court's failure to take up this case. Now, in a decision that goes even a little beyond my fundamental support for the Fourth Amendment, today the Supreme Court issued a ruling that police officers must generally have warrants to enter a home's driveway in search of stolen vehicles. Now, the case arose from a Virginia man named Ryan Collins, no relation to your humble host. He's a motorcyclist who twice committed traffic offenses while riding a distinctive orange and black motorcycle with an extended frame. Cops gave chase, but the man eluded them, and they said at one point his speeds exceeded 140 miles an hour. So an enterprising police officer went on Facebook and saw a picture of a very similar motorcycle on a specific driveway. So he tracked down the address, which is the home of Collins' girlfriend. Now, without a warrant or an invitation, the officer named Rhodes visited the property. He saw what appeared to be a motorcycle covered in a tarp. So he walked up the driveway, lifted the tarp, and identified the motorcycle as a stolen one. So at the state level, Collins was convicted of receiving stolen property after Virginia courts rejected his motion to suppress the evidence because of the police officer's search without a warrant. And the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that the search was proper under the automobile exception to the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement, which is based on the mobility of vehicles, right? So you never know exactly where they'll show up next. But the Supreme Court believes that when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, the home is first among equals, and the amendment's protections extend to a home's curtilage. That's a legal term for the areas around the building that is a house or a home, and that includes driveways. So, with an 8-justice majority, the only dissent came from Sam Alito. Justice Sotomayor wrote, "The question before the court is whether the automobile exception justifies the invasion of the curtilage. The answer is no. To allow an officer to rely on the automobile exception to gain entry into a house or its curtilage for the purpose of conducting a vehicle search would unmoor the exception from its justifications, render hollow the core of Fourth Amendment protection, and transform what was meant to be an exception into a tool with far broader application." Now, I actually think this is going a little far, because the officer should have had a warrant, but this motorcycle was visible from the street. So I do consider it a bit of a wobbler. And what I'd really love to see is the Supreme Court take a hard and fast position on my Fourth Amendment rights to be free of surveillance by the NSA and the dragnet system that exists in the United States today. Well, today, as I speak to you, my nearby Starbucks is shut down along with the 8,000 other locations around the country. They're spending 4 hours with the doors shut, conducting racial bias training for employees. Now, there are people who are critical of this. Here's a quote from T.J. Legacy Cole, an Orlando political organizer. "This bias training is a self-righteous and disingenuous public relations stunt to glorify a white-owned corporation for making a feeble attempt to combat systemic racism without investing in the communities or people most affected by its oppression." Now, he may have a point. But as it goes, we've never seen an American company issue a stand down to every one of its locations across the country. And I think this is a valuable step forward. The other big change is that Starbucks announced that anybody can use their bathrooms now, with or without the purchase of a beverage. And I think that is highly significant because it is jockeying over access to bathrooms that often leads people to hang out at a Starbucks. And this is also an indicator of the lack of public facilities in most urban areas around the country. And you buy a coffee, you know what happens next. You got to pee. And even if you don't have coffee in your system, you got to pee. So with Starbucks making that dramatic effort, even if it does come up short, certainly if they sold franchises to African Americans, that might make a difference. If they promoted more African Americans to management positions, that might make a difference. And maybe those will follow this, I don't know. But I am not prepared to criticize Starbucks until I see a little bit more about the long-term impact of this effort. Now, as Starbucks tries to deal with the racial bias that most Americans have in their systems, Roseanne Barr has tweeted herself into a canceled TV series. Now, I don't know what provoked her to put out a tweet against Valerie Jarrett, who's no longer in the public eye. She was a top advisor to Barack Obama. She is African American. She's from Chicago. And Roseanne tweeted, Muslim Brotherhood and Planet of the Apes had a baby equals VJ for Valerie Jarrett. Now, again, I don't know the context of this if there was one. But in an effort to save her show, Roseanne Barr tweeted today, I apologize to Valerie Jarrett and to all Americans. I am truly sorry for making a bad joke about her politics and her looks. I should have known better. Forgive me. My joke was in bad taste. And recently, Roseanne stooped to attacking Stormy Daniels, the porn actress at the center of the Trump scandal, about whether he slept with her or not and whether she can talk about it or not, and Michael Cohen's gag deal. But for some reason, Roseanne Barr accused Stormy Daniels of doing porn scenes involving anal sex. Now, I have never looked at any porn of Stormy Daniels, so I don't know, but she fired back right away saying, I have never done an anal scene. And to see these two people, and shall we politely say on the low end of the socioeconomic spectrum here in the United States, fight it out, was really just deplorable. That's the only term I can come up with. So after this exchange, Roseanne Barr, before ABC announced they're canceling her series, which came in number 3 in the overall ratings this season, she announced that she was leaving Twitter. And it's not the first time she's attempted to break her Twitter habit. But for me, this underscores, number 1, that racism is alive and well in this country. It has flourished under Donald Trump, giving permission to people like Roseanne Barr to push the limits, to seek notoriety by making these kinds of outrageous statements. And there was ABC ready to cash in, giving Roseanne a platform to promote hate and division. And this is why I go crazy when they want to blame it on Russia and those silly Facebook ads that allegedly came out of the St. Petersburg troll farm, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. Because Americans do a great job of dividing ourselves, and it hardly takes any magnification or amplification from Russia to get Americans to fight each other in some of the ugliest ways known to humanity. Today, the tensions between Israel and those trapped in Gaza reached a breaking point, and it's hard to understand who started what. But on Sunday, there was an exchange between an Israeli tank, which shelled a monitoring position, an outpost of the Islamic Jihad of Gaza. And I believe that 3 Palestinians were killed in that event. 3 Israeli Defense Force soldiers were wounded in today's attacks when as many as 30 mortar shells were fired from Gaza into southern Israel. And we have no other reports of injuries, no reports of fatalities. But of course, this has been building for months now. And while I do support the aspirations of the Palestinian people, I don't support this kind of attack on Israel because it produces the predictable, disproportionate response. And I am sorry to see that Gazans feel so desperate that this is the kind of move that they take. So yeah, here is the citation. Tensions rose Sunday when an Israeli tank killed 3 members of Islamic Jihad in Gaza, which the Israelis said was in response to an attempted bombing along the fence line with Israel. And in addition to the airstrikes that were launched against Gaza today, the effort to open up the port of Gaza is ongoing. There is a flotilla which includes American Elizabeth Murray, and you can read her account at Consortium News today, that is launching the latest flotilla attempting to break the Israeli blockade by sea. And of course, we know that the last flotillas have been intercepted in international waters, and Israel has used brazen efforts to not only suppress the rights of the international parties trying to sail to Gaza, but also they have lied about the nature of the contact that they had with these unarmed and nonviolent protesters. So we will see where this leads, and it's hard to imagine in the current circumstances that it will lead in a positive direction. Also in the Middle East, there's a lot of tongue wagging right now because the organization, which is known as the Conference on Disarmament, which monitors the use of chemical weapons, has a rotating leadership, and it goes every 4 weeks to a different country. And last month it was Switzerland, and alphabetically, this month it is Syria. Now, Syria could have declined this honor, and in my opinion, they probably should have. And as you know, I'm highly skeptical of the false flag incidents, that's how I view them, that have occurred over the last few years. Most recently in the Duma area near Damascus, and also in Khan Shaykhun in April of 2017. That said, I do believe the reports that Syria has used chlorine in these very crude barrel bombs that are dropped from helicopters. And so, while I do believe that Syria has been framed in some of these high-profile cases where we're told that nerve agents were used, I do consider it inappropriate for Syria to be chairing the panel that investigates chemical weapon use. Also, the Skripal story from England, Sergei and Yulia. Sergei, the Russian double agent who's retired in England, and we know that they were reportedly the subjects of a nerve agent attack which has been labeled Novichok in March in Salisbury, England. And the story at BuzzFeed today is almost fact-free. While it is fact-free, we hear the medical director at Salisbury District Hospital say we don't know what the long-term medical impact will be on the Skripals. Quote, "We have a total world experience of treating 3 patients for the effects of Novichok poisoning, and I think it's safe to say that we're still learning." So this is pure puffery. They don't reference how the Skripals were put into induced comas. We have never heard an honest medical report about the symptoms that they experienced and the treatments that were therefore addressed to those symptoms. And we have never seen any public evidence that led to the claims that this Novichok was in fact the agent used, and no one has been able to prove the origins of this alleged nerve agent that was put on the doorknob at the Skripal home. But that hasn't stopped England, the United States, and the U.S. media from flatly declaring without any evidence that Russia is responsible, and as you know, it led to the expulsion of diplomats and a new round of sanctions. Now that I've slammed BuzzFeed, I do have a bit of praise for them today, because since Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands last fall, BuzzFeed has been skeptical of the death toll that was issued by Puerto Rican authorities. And today, the New England Journal of Medicine has published a completed study. And I want to be clear about what this means. They are now estimating that up to 8,000 people died after Hurricane Maria. Not people who were, caught as a tree collapsed or a building collapsed and killed directly by the hurricane, but they were killed because of the hurricane and the failed response. The months of no electricity, the time it took to reopen roads and hospitals, and the study estimates that about 5,740 people died as a result of the storm, but the Puerto Rican government's current official death toll remains at a mere 64. Now, the governor of Puerto Rico, quoted in the BuzzFeed story, is coming around to this. Governor Ricardo Rossello, at a press conference today, said there's really no logical explanation for us wanting to suppress the numbers. We want the real number to come out. We had a protocol that really was subpar, and we recognize it, and now, really towards the future, we want to make sure that it's effective. Every day I pause to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Anna Gordonier, Mona Kobus, Brian Mazzy, Jerry White, they each kick in $5 a month. The cost of a Starbucks hipster coffee, with or without racial bias training. And I invite you to become a subscriber too. It's how I pay the bills and eke out a modest paycheck for your humble host for hosting this podcast. So if you're not a subscriber, let's fix that. Visit peterbcollins.com. Find the menu button. When you pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and it's easy in a couple of minutes to choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you're allergic to PayPal, you can always communicate with me using the U.S. mail. My address is Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. That's Box 150, 660, San Rafael, zip code 94915. Well, while I was off, I saw that letter that Trump wrote to Kim Jong-un, canceling the June 12th summit in Singapore, blaming the Koreans for it. And of course, it was the Korean reaction to the incredible statements from John Bolton, backed up by Vice President Pence, about the Libyan option that really led North Korea to say, are we dealing with an honorable summit here? And of course, I understand who North Korea is. I understand who Kim Jong-un is. I'm not trying to elevate them to any kind of holy status. And as you know, I've been critical of Trump from the get-go for elevating North Korea to the status of a world power. That said, the June 12th summit meeting was canceled by Trump, apparently because he felt that he wanted to cancel them before they could cancel him. And now it appears that we're back on track. There is a top North Korean envoy winging his way to New York to meet with Secretary of State Pompeo. And Trump is taking credit for this. This is a solid response to his letter. But I differ, because over the weekend, President Moon of South Korea and Kim Jong-un had another meeting, unscheduled, unscripted, and apparently not approved by the United States. And I think Trump fears that if he doesn't get back in the game here, that the two Koreas will work out a deal that just eliminates him, cuts him out as an unnecessary middleman. And so the relevance of Trump in this ongoing deal with North Korea is something that is fluctuating, and that makes him insecure, And that causes him to do things like canceling and then allowing it to be put back on track. And of course, Trump has completely unrealistic expectations of what Kim Jong-un means by denuclearization and how quickly it might occur. Also, last night when I got back, I watched the Thursday night Rachel Maddow program where Andrea Mitchell came on to discuss this with Rachel. And at that point, they flatly declared the talks were dead, and then they kind of tipped their hands that they think this is a good thing. And while I have great discomfort with Trump as a negotiator, and I believe he can be played by Kim Jong-un, I think it's in everybody's interest to proceed with this meeting and to see exactly what gets put on the table, and if we can conclude a treaty to end the 1950s Korean War and put things on a track to some sort of normalization by lifting sanctions as North Korea takes confidence-building steps. That's how diplomacy works. But Trump has this belief that he can go in and just pound the table and come away with everything he wants instantly. And we also know that he has declined to prepare for this meeting by reading briefing books and listening to people explain the history. And that, of course, is a very risky approach to this kind of a meeting. Meanwhile, I'm getting whiplash because while I was away, Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, who's been a point man for Trump in the trade war with China, he declared that we've found a truce, that China is going to buy more U.S. products and open their markets to American companies. But today, we went full bore into the depressive part of the manic-depressive cycle. The Trump administration said today it would proceed with plans to impose a series of punitive trade-related measures on China in the next month. The U.S. will move ahead with a plan to levy 25% tariffs on $50 billion of imported Chinese goods, despite recent remarks by Mnuchin and other administration officials that the tariffs would be suspended while the countries continue negotiations. So, we're going to find out, apparently, by June 15th, the exact list of items subject to tariffs, and we're told the duties will be imposed shortly after that. And while I was in Hollywood, talking to some of my friends who work in the movie business, I learned that currently China limits the importation of U.S.-made feature films to 34 per year. And in the discussions recently, that number, I believe, was almost doubled. So that's one of the industries that you might not think of as affected by these Trump tariff threats, which have been related to cars and soybeans and solar panels and things like that. But we also learned that Trump has ironed out the little problem with that state-owned cell phone manufacturer ZTE. He says he reached a deal that will allow that company to remain in business. We don't know the details of that, but we do know that in the same time frame, Ivanka Trump was notified by the Chinese government that a group of her license applications to do business and to protect trademarks in China have been granted. And so behind the smokescreen of the trade war, there is this mutual back-scratching and profiteering between President Xi and President Trump. And boy, is it ugly. And speaking of ugly, over the weekend, Trump couldn't put his tweeter machine down. Over a dozen tweets about the Mueller investigation. And he's really obsessed with this. One of the latest from early this morning reads this way: why aren't the 13 angry and heavily conflicted Democrats investigating the totally crooked campaign of totally crooked Hillary Clinton? It's a rigged witch hunt, that's why. Ask them if they enjoyed her after-election celebration. Now, this guy is really going off the rails as if he's ever been on them. But last week, while I didn't agree with the term Spygate and his repeated assertions that the Obama administration had inserted a spy in the Trump campaign, the issues related to the secret informant, whose name is no longer secret, but the mainstream media is still playing that game. As recently as last night, MSNBC would not name Stephen Halper, the American who teaches in Britain and who was given the assignment to rub elbows with 2 or 3 of the Trump campaign lackeys. And so Trump was actually onto something with that could have turned the tables and undermined the credibility of the Mueller investigation. And now, by making these phony attacks on the political affiliation of lawyers on Mueller's team, as if that simply is a conclusive fact that they are biased against him, well, this is where he comes off the rails. And it just makes things more confusing, which appears to be one of his goals. Now, over the weekend, Showtime released the first episode of a series called The Fourth Estate. And it's about the New York Times. It is shot as a fly-on-the-wall, behind-the-scenes reality kind of show. It profiles the editors and the reporters. But it is so frustrating because it is narrowly focused on the Russia investigation, the Russia narrative, that the New York Times has been a major promoter of. And they don't reveal any of its sources, the anonymous leaks and the documents that they got. And it is so selectively edited that it appears to be a defensive promotional piece to explain to people why Trump attacks the New York Times for fake news and how hard they're working to get the real news and that they deserve a Pulitzer. They were awarded a Pulitzer for the fact-free reporting on Russiagate in the past year. So I don't know if you've had a chance to view it, but I found it highly frustrating and mostly a waste of time. Over at Freedom and Accuracy in Reporting, the group called FAIR, they've called out Facebook and the Atlantic Council and the coverage of their new partnership by corporate media. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And you may have heard that last week, Facebook announced that it's partnering with the think tank called the Atlantic Council to monitor for misinformation and foreign interference. Now, the details of this plan are vague, but the press release said that they're going to design tools to bring us closer together instead of driving us further apart. Now, FAIR dug into who is the Atlantic Council and who funds it. Well, members include the U.S. Navy, Army, and Air Force, NATO, various foreign powers, major Western corporations, including weapons contractors and oil companies. It is the dead center of what Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes called the blob, Washington's bipartisan foreign policy consensus. Now, members include and funders include the United Arab Emirates, Britain, Norway, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Now, are these influencers who you trust to decide what is fake news and what is not? I encourage you to read the piece at FAIR through the link provided in the show file for today's podcast. Last week also, we saw alarms sounded that as many as 1,500 immigrant children have been lost by the Trump administration. And when you dig into it, these are migrant children who arrived at the border unaccompanied. Now, there's a separate and very alarming issue about the efforts to separate parents from their children when they come to the border presently. But this goes back to last year, and when children arrive, they are handed over to the Department of Health and Human Services, which runs the Refugee Resettlement Program. And last October, the Health and Human Services Department decided to follow up on the placement of some of these children with sponsors in the United States. And they were tracking a total of about 6,000 of them. 28 had run away, 5 had been deported, 52 relocated to live with somebody else. But they said they couldn't track down the rest. And this led to people saying that they had been lost or unaccounted for. But it appears that this could be as simple as phone calls that were not returned. So to me, the larger issue is what happens to these kids who are not put with a sponsor family. And we saw pictures over the last few days of kids sleeping in these giant cages in large warehouse-type facilities. It appears to be subhuman and deeply inhumane. And the Jeff Sessions zero tolerance policy is leading to the separation of parents and children. And what's really cruel is they've got the ability to figure out if they put a parent in detention center A and they send his child to detention center B, that they can notify the parent and child where the parent or child happens to be. But it appears that we don't do that, and that it's simple barbarism at play. Finally today, I am surprised that the Trump Justice Department has made maneuvers that appear to make the huge merger of Bayer and Monsanto a little more palatable. Now, I don't have all the details yet, but federal antitrust regulators have approved the merger, but only after the two companies spin off $9 billion worth of assets, including Bayer selling its seed and herbicide businesses to a third party. And this was the greatest concern that I had, that the Roundup, which is glyphosate, that product would be managed from Germany, putting any U.S. enforcement or regulation beyond the reach, or at least making it more difficult in the future. So this is the narrow information that I have. I will study it further, and if it warrants more reporting, you'll hear it right here on the Peter B. Collins Podcast. Thanks for listening today. You'll find this podcast at YouTube, and I hope you'll share it far and wide. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. 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 Happy trails to you